Would you survive a London season? Imagine this, it's 1890, you've barely learned how to curtsy without falling over, and suddenly you're expected to spend 3 months in London, smiling through dinners, waltzing until dawn, and pretending to enjoy cucumber sandwiches, while your mother quietly auctions off your future to the highest ranking. Because the London season wasn't just about gowns and glittering balls, it was a social marathon where fortunes were gambled, reputations made or destroyed, and marriage wasn't romance, it was strategy. From April to July, the richest families in Britain abandoned their country estates and descended on Mayfair, Belgravia, and Kensington, hauling entire wardrobes of Worth gowns, silver tea sets, and daughters in need of husbands. And if you think this sounds like a 19th century version of a reality dating show, you're not entirely wrong. Except, instead of roses, you got invitations. Instead of a dramatic exit, you got cut from the guest list. Tonight, we're stepping into the ballrooms, racecourses, and scandal-filled drawing rooms of London's Gilded Age season. What did it take to succeed? Who fell spectacularly short? And why did so many ambitious Americans throw themselves into the chaos, with both pearls and pocketbooks at the ready? So settle in, fluff your imaginary ostrich feathers, and let your mind wander through candlelit halls and gossip-filled carriages. These are the gowns, balls, and scandals of the London season. And if you really enjoy this kind of history to drift off to, don't forget to subscribe, tap that like button, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these stories are keeping you company. Every spring, like swallows heading for warmer skies, Britain's aristocracy packed up their sprawling country estates and migrated to London. Only instead of feathers and instinct, they had steam trains and staff lists. The rhythm was as reliable as the changing seasons, the hunt in autumn, the frost-bitten house parties in winter. And then, once Parliament opened its doors in spring, the season began. The idea was simple. Why spend your days brooding in a draughty castle in Yorkshire when you could spend 3 months in Mayfair throwing glittering dinners, parading your daughters, and making sure your family name didn't slip into obscurity? Country life had its charms: fox hunts, pheasant shoots, endless cups of tea before fireplaces that never seemed large enough to actually heat a room. But it was quiet, too quiet. If you wanted to be seen, and in the upper classes, being seen was practically a survival skill, you had to be in London. So, every April, families descended upon the capital. Townhouses in Mayfair, Belgravia, and Kensington, which had been shuttered and silent all winter, were reopened. Servants aired out the rooms, replaced moth-eaten curtains, and polished the silver until it blinded you. Drawing rooms were redecorated not because they were shabby, but because last year's drapes had already been seen. God forbid Lady So-and-so notice you were recycling your interior design. If the countryside was about permanence and tradition, London was about performance. A season was essentially one long theatre production, and everyone had a role to play. Mothers as directors, daughters as leading ladies, and fathers as the reluctant financiers, wondering why so much coal and champagne had gone missing. Of course, this seasonal migration wasn't as simple as tossing a few bags in the boot. Entire households moved. Steam trains groaned under the weight of trunks filled with gowns from Worth in Paris, family jewels nestled in velvet, and enough hats to outfit a small army. And then there was the silver. Families didn't trust London's silversmiths to supply their tableware, so they brought their own. Entire sets of forks, spoons, platters, and tureens. Imagine arriving at your rental apartment today with not just your suitcase, but also your own cutlery, crockery, and light fixtures. That was the level of paranoia. Servants travelled too, of course. Maids, footmen, cooks, butlers, though they were rarely thrilled about swapping a manageable country household for the manic pace of London entertaining. For them, the season meant 12-hour days of hauling, polishing, ironing, and trying not to faint while serving soup in starched collars during a heatwave. Once in London, families installed themselves in their townhouse. These weren't modest pied-à-terre. They were palatial homes in their own right, soaring ceiling, drawing rooms designed for hundreds of guests, grand staircases made for the dramatic entrance of a debutante in a white satin gown. In Mayfair and Belgravia, rows of these townhouses stood shoulder to shoulder, like peacocks lined up to be admired. Inside, the interiors were dripping with luxury, gilded mirrors, silk wallpaper, chandeliers wired with the miracle of electric light when it didn't short out, and endless carpets imported from the East. Everything was designed to impress, down to the placement of the ormolu clocks on the mantelpiece. And yet, for all their grandeur, these homes were often slightly ridiculous. Kitchens were still stuck in the basement, meaning dinners climbed several flights of stairs before reaching the table. Bathrooms were scarce, drafts were plentiful, and the smell of horse-drawn carriages outside mingled with coal smoke in a way no lavender sachet could quite mask. Luxury, in short, was always accompanied by a hint of inconvenience. The whole thing existed because of Parliament. When Parliament sat in spring, the aristocracy had an excuse, or rather a duty, to come to London. The men were meant to discuss legislation, shake hands with fellow grandees, and occasionally nap on the benches of the House of Lords. Their wives and daughters, meanwhile, filled the social calendar with balls, luncheons, and charity fêtes. It was a perfect symbiosis. Men pretended to govern, women pretended to socialize, and everyone knew the real work was matchmaking. Titles needed money. Money needed title, and the ballroom was where the negotiations took place. The start of the season felt less like a holiday and more like mobilizing for battle. Guest lists were drawn up with military precision. Invitations were deployed like tactical maneuvers. Never too many, never too few, and always aimed at the right target. Drawing rooms were redecorated, staircases polished, and carriages readied. Parisian dressmakers worked overtime. A single Worth gown might cost more than a year's wages for a servant. But then, the gown wasn't just clothing, it was ammunition. Appear in the right dress, at the right ball, and you might secure a future duke as a husband. Appear in the wrong one, and you were yesterday's news by dessert. The mothers knew this. They were the generals of the season, whispering strategy into their daughters' ears, charting which dances to accept and which heirs to avoid. Daughters might dream of romance, but mothers thought in terms of dowries and estates. It was a high-stakes game, played in silk gloves and ostrich feathers. By July, the glamour began to wilt, quite literally. Coal smoke, horse manure, and the Thames conspired to make London unbearable in summer heat. Foreign visitors complained of the stench, though Londoners themselves pretended not to notice. It became tradition. Once Parliament closed, families fled back to their estates, carrying their tired daughters and moth-eaten gowns with them. It's worth remembering that beneath the silks and diamonds, London, in the late 19th century, was still a city of contrast. Aristocrats waltzed in Mayfair, just a mile away. Whole families crowded into one-room tenements in Whitechapel. Servants scurried from glittering kitchens to coal cellars. Even as fortunes and titles were traded in ballroom, poverty pressed against the city's edges. The season floated above all this, a glittering bubble that pretended the rest of London didn't exist. To modernize, the whole migration seems absurd. Imagine shutting up your family mansion, moving to a new mansion, and throwing months of parties as a matter of duty. And yet, that was exactly the point. The London season wasn't leisure, it was obligation. Families with fading fortunes saw it as their last chance to marry off a daughter. Families with too much money saw it as their chance to buy a title. It was, in short, Britain's version of speed dating, except drawn out over 3 months, fueled by champagne, and requiring several tons of luggage. And at the very heart of it all stood the debutante. Young women waiting nervously to be presented at court, in front of Queen Victoria herself. Their gowns were regulation, their fans trembling, their mothers hissing last-minute instructions. One curtsy done badly, and a family's entire strategy could collapse in seconds. Because in the London season, The curtain only truly rose when the debutantes stepped into the palace. If the London season was a theatre production, the presentation at court was opening night. Every young aristocratic woman, and quite a few ambitious Americans, had to make her debut in front of Queen Victoria. It wasn't just a formality, it was a ritual, a rite of passage, and frankly, a test of whether you could survive the London season without fainting, tripping, or embarrassing your family so badly that your name became a punchline over tea. Debutantes were required to wear white satin gowns, not cream, not ivory, but white, as if they were all auditioning for the same wedding. The gowns had to be trimmed with lace and pearls, accessorized with ostrich feathers perched precariously in their hair. An ivory fan completed the ensemble, although the fan's real purpose was less keep cool and more hide trembling hands. The result? A room full of young women who looked like ethereal angels and felt like sweating wrecks. Imagine the pressure of prom night multiplied by 10, with the Queen of England staring you down as judge and jury. The ostrich feathers were especially treacherous. Too tall, and you looked ridiculous. Too short, and you looked cheap. And heaven help you if the feather bobbed out of rhythm with your curtsy. The gossip columns would notice. The most dreaded part of the presentation was the curtsy. It had to be deep, slow, and dignified. You had to hold eye contact with the Queen the whole time, as though you were pledging eternal loyalty while simultaneously not collapsing under the weight of 20 pounds of satin and nerves. Mothers hissed last-minute instructions. Back straight, knees bent, don't topple, don't faint. A successful curtsy meant invitations to garden parties, balls, and luncheons. A failed curtsy meant your social calendar would look like a desert. Modern comparison? It was like walking a red carpet where one wrong step could get you blacklisted by Hollywood, except the carpet was an inch too slippery. The dress weighed a small child, and your parents had bet the family fortune on you not falling over. Why so much fuss? Because being presented at court wasn't just a ceremony, it was your official entry into the marriage market. Without it, you were nobody. With it, you were eligible to dance with dukes, flirt with viscounts, and hopefully land a husband before July. Failure meant more than embarrassment. It meant fewer invitations, fewer chances to be seen, and fewer prospects. In a world where marriage was security, influence, and sometimes survival, one wobbly curtsy could alter your entire future. It's easy to laugh at the pomp of it all, feathers, fans, and curtsies, like a synchronized sport. But imagine the pressure, your family's reputation riding on whether your knees creaked at the wrong angle. In many ways, it was Britain's most polite version of the Hunger Game, except instead of fighting with weapons, you fought with posture, lace, and a smile that said, "Yes, Your Majesty, I am absolutely thrilled to be here and definitely not about to faint." Once the debutantes had survived the gauntlet of court, the real season began. Night after night, London's grand houses threw open their doors. Dinners, balls, musicales, card parties. It was a carousel of champagne, candlelight, and gossip. Invitations were the currency of the season. To be invited to the right ball meant you were in. To be excluded meant you might as well pack up your gowns and head back to the countryside. Invitations were issued, counted, compared, and sometimes traded with the seriousness of stock portfolios, and the competition was fierce. Aristocratic hostesses planned their guest lists like military campaigns. Who to invite, who to snub, who to seat next to whom. It was matchmaking, politics, and social strategy wrapped in one. A young lady might dance with 20 men in a single night, but the real negotiations happened in whispers behind fans, in who was paired for supper, in who was accidentally introduced to whom. Every movement was deliberate, every glance was calculated. The pinnacle of extravagance came in June of 1897, during Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. The Duchess of Devonshire hosted a ball at her London residence so spectacular that people are still talking about. It was a costume ball, but not your average mask and cloak affair. Guests arrived dressed as historical figures. Queen Elizabeth III brushed shoulders with Madame de Pompadour. Cleopatra exchanged pleasantries with Charles II. The Duchess herself went as Zenobia, Queen of Palmyra, draped in pearls and enough fabric to upholster a railway carriage. Consuelo Vanderbilt attended with her husband, the Duke of Marlborough. He dressed as a French ambassador in a costume so elaborate, velvet, silver embroidery, pearls, and diamonds, that it cost the equivalent of thousands of pounds today. Imagine paying a small fortune for an outfit you'd wear once and spill champagne on. The decorations transformed Devonshire House into scenes of antiquity. Rooms were redone as Roman villas, medieval halls, and Renaissance courts. It was less a ball and more an immersive theatre production, except everyone was both cast and audience. For all the grandeur, the underlying motive was matchmaking. The season was less about dancing and more about evaluating who had money, who had titles, who had scandalous debts hidden behind a charming smile. Mothers worked harder than any politician, shuttling daughters from one ball to the next, ensuring no opportunity was missed. Daughters were paraded, heirs were appraised, and discreet inquiries were made about fortunes and reputations. Gossip was the invisible glue that held it all together. A broken engagement could ripple through the season like a scandalous wave. A whispered rumor could sink a family's prospects faster than any financial crisis. Imagine walking into a ballroom, chandeliers blazing, gowns shimmering under candlelight and electric bulbs, music filling the air as couples waltzed, skirts swishing, jewels glittering, the heat of too many bodies, the scent of roses, champagne, and perfume mingling with coal smoke from the lamps. For the debutantes, it was intoxicating. For their mothers, it was exhausting. For the fathers, it was expensive. And for society, it was theatre. Everyone was watching, everyone was judging, and everyone was pretending not to. It's easy to picture these events as romantic, swirling gowns, candlelit waltzes. But remember, half the guests were bored, the other half were scheming, and everyone had sore feet. It was less Cinderella and more The Bachelor with better costume, because beneath the glitter, the balls were business meetings in disguise. Instead of PowerPoint slides, there were Strauss waltzes. Instead of contracts, there were dance cards. And instead of LinkedIn, there were gossip columns. But not everything in the season happened at night. By day, the social game continued in grand style. At Ascot, at Henley, at the Derby, where top hats, parasols, and racehorses became the backdrop for yet more flirting, scheming, and showing off. Because in the London season, the parties never truly stopped, they simply changed scenery. The London season was, at its heart, a fashion show masquerading as a marriage market. If the balls were the stage, the gowns were the script, and every hemline, every ostrich feather, every pearl had meaning. Fashion wasn't frivolous. It was social armor. The undisputed king of the season's wardrobes was Charles Frederick Worth, an Englishman who set up shop in Paris and became the father of haute couture. To be dressed by Worth was to announce that you had both money and taste, or, at the very least, money. His gowns were shipped to London in trunks the size of coffins, padded with tissue, guarded like treasure. Other Parisian houses, Paquin, Doucet, Calosseurs, competed fiercely, but Worth was the name that made society mothers breathe a little easier. Each gown was handmade, tailored to flatter and, ideally, distract. The wrong sleeve could cost you a dance. The right train could catch the eye of a duke. How many gowns did a debutante need? Dozens, sometimes hundreds. A single ball could ruin a gown with spilled champagne or enthusiastic waltzing, and God forbid you repeated an outfit at a major event. Fashion photographers didn't exist, but gossip columnists did, and they noticed everything. Daytime required lighter gowns of muslin or silk, trimmed with lace. Garden parties meant florals and parasols. Evenings called for satin, velvet, and jewels heavy enough to threaten a spinal injury. And for the ultimate horror, white satin at a court presentation, which showed every bead of nervous sweat. It was a constant cycle of fittings, alterations, and frantic unpacking of trunks. Behind every glittering entrance was a lady's maid muttering curses as she tried to tame fabric into obedience. Fashion in the season wasn't just about beauty, it was about codes. Don't outshine the hostess. Appear in a gown more elaborate than hers, and you risked permanent exile from her guest list. Don't underdress. Appear too simple, and whispers began. Perhaps your fortune was thinner than your fabric. Hats, status. The taller the hat at Ascot, the higher the implied social standing. If your hat didn't threaten to block someone's view of the horses, were you even trying? Jewelry etiquette. Diamonds were for married women, pearls for debutantes. Break this rule, and you announced either ignorance or desperation. Dry truth, the London season had more dress codes than a modern-day private school, and far harsher punishments for breaking them. Every gown was a statement. A mother might spend the equivalent of a townhouse mortgage on her daughter's wardrobe, calculating that the right impression could land a son-in-law with an estate worth 10 times more. It was, in effect, financial warfare fought with satin and sequin. And if the heiress herself disliked the gown, too bad. The dress wasn't meant to please her, it was meant to please the room. And into this glittering, suffocating world of feathers and fans marched a new kind of competitor, the American, bold, ambitious, and very, very rich. To the British they were curiosities at first, then essential lifeline, because while their gowns were Parisian, their fortunes were pure Gilded Age gold. If the London season was already a battlefield of gowns and gossip, the arrival of American heiresses turned it into something closer to an arms race. To the British aristocracy, these young women were both shocking novelty and desperately needed reinforcements. Because while dukes and earls had titles stretching back centuries, many of their estates were crumbling faster than their pride. What they lacked in cash, American families had in obscene abundance. The British dubbed them the dollar princesses. It wasn't meant kindly. The nickname dripped with both disdain and envy, as though the Americans were storming the gates of tradition, armed with nothing but gold, which, in a sense, they were. At first, the British sniffed at their accents, their boldness, their tendency to speak without waiting for 3 generations of pedigree to back them up. But as roofs collapsed and creditors came knocking, disdain softened into pragmatism. Suddenly, a Vanderbilt dowry or an Astor fortune looked like the best inheritance a duke could hope for. The London season became the perfect stage for this transatlantic bargain. American heiresses arrived with trunks stuffed with worth gowns, mothers determined to secure title, and fathers willing to fund entire wings of castles if it meant their daughters became duchesses. In exchange, British families offered history, titles, and entry into an ancient world of tradition. The marriages were often business arrangements disguised as romance. Money flowed one way, coronets the other. Everyone got something, even if happiness was not guaranteed. The most famous example, of course, was Consuelo Vanderbilt. Pressured by her mother, Alva, she married the Duke of Marlborough in 1895. The wedding was less about a love story and more of a corporate merger. Vanderbilt millions for Blenheim Palace's survival. Consuelo wept through the ceremony, but society applauded. Then there was Jenny Jerome, an earlier trailblazer. She was an American who married Lord Randolph Churchill. Their son, Winston, would go on to become rather more famous than anyone in the season could have imagined. Jenny brought beauty, wit, and American energy into British society, qualities that both charmed and unsettled her new world. These women were symbols of the bargain, American boldness meeting British stiffness, dollars propping up crumbling title. The contrast was stark. American women laughed louder, spoke more freely, and didn't always follow the rigid etiquette that British society worshipped. They were modern, impatient, sometimes even daring. The British, by comparison, prized restraint, understatement, and the art of saying absolutely nothing while making you feel completely judged. At a ball, the difference was obvious. The American debutante swept into the room like she owned it, feathers quivering, smile broad. The British debutante entered like she was apologizing for existing, eyes lowered, curtsy practiced to perfection. The Americans often scandalized society and then quietly took it over. Titles that had sneered at them one year were begging for their company the next. The truth is, both sides needed each other. The Americans wanted titles, the British needed money. Together, they propped up the illusion of aristocracy for another generation. It was a marriage market in the most literal sense, one that relied on transatlantic shipping schedule as much as candlelit waltzes, dry humor. Think of it as the original international mergers and acquisitions, except with tiaras and more champagne. So, while British society tried to hold on to its traditions and Americans arrived armed with fortune, the season rolled on, gowns rustling at night, parasols twirling by day. And if the evenings belonged to the ballrooms, the daylight hours had their own stage, Ascot, Henley, and the Derby, where the social game continued under the sun. The London season was not all ballrooms and midnight waltzes. By day, society still had to see and be seen, just in settings where champagne was replaced with lemonade, and flirting happened under parasols rather than chandeliers. If the evening was for strategy, the daytime was for display. Every outing became a catwalk, every picnic a business meeting, and every horse race a chance to prove that your hat was taller than your rival. First, the crown jewel, Royal Ascot. For 5 days in June, everyone who was anyone descended on the racecourse at Ascot, turning it into an outdoor theatre of wealth and fashion. Aristocrats, heiresses, politicians, and royalty all mingled, though mingled might be too generous a word. They observed each other, like rival peacocks strutting and pretending not to care. Men wore morning coats, top hats polished to mirrors, and ties so stiff they risked cutting off circulation. Women appeared in gowns designed to outshine one another, topped with hats so elaborate they defied physics. Ostrich plumes, silk flowers, even stuffed birds, the bigger the better. Entire family reputations seemed to rest on whether a hat could be spotted from across the enclosure. And then there was the royal enclosure, the most exclusive section of all. To get in, you needed not only an invitation, but also a sponsor. 2, in fact, each with at least 6 years of membership. It was like the aristocratic equivalent of getting a blue check mark on social media, except harder. Once inside, you were guaranteed proximity to royalty and the assurance that you had arrived. The horses, meanwhile, were mostly background. Yes, bets were placed, and the royal family dutifully watched the races, but for most attendees, the real sport was scanning the crowd. Who was seen with whom, who wore what, and whose hat collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. Dry truth. Royal Ascot was essentially London Fashion Week meets the Kentucky Derby, but with more feathers and fewer smiles. If Ascot was the grand peacock display, the Henley Royal Regatta was its flirtatious cousin. Held on the banks of the River Thames, Henley was nominally about boat races, long, elegant shells slicing through the water to the applause of well-bred spectators. In reality, the regatta was an excuse for riverside picnics, parasols, and endless opportunities for discreet conversation just out of earshot of the chaperone. Picture it, striped tents fluttering in the breeze, hampers overflowing with cold chicken, strawberries, and bottles of champagne disguised as lemonade. Young men in blazers and straw boaters strolled along the riverbank, while young women twirled parasols and practiced the delicate art of looking both available and unattainable at the same time. For ambitious debutantes, Henley was ideal. Unlike the stiff formality of a ballroom, here you could linger in conversation by the water, laugh a little too loudly at a joke, or allow your parasol to accidentally tilt just enough to reveal a smile. Entire courtships were launched between races, while the poor rowers, sweating, straining, and entirely ignored, did the actual work. Modern comparison. Henley was essentially Coachella for the upper classes, minus the music, plus a great deal more salmon sandwiches. And then there was the Epsom Derby. If Ascot was polished and Henley flirtatious, the Derby was chaotic. Held on Epsom Downs, it drew not just aristocrats, but also actors, actresses, gamblers, and even the occasional royal. It was one of the few times British society actually rubbed shoulders across class lines, though usually while pretending not to notice. The atmosphere was rowdy, noisy, and unpredictable. Aristocrats sipped champagne in private boxes while just a few feet away, working-class crowds shouted at the horses and downed pints. It was the most democratic event of the season, and therefore both thrilling and terrifying for anyone worried about their reputation. For young ladies, the Derby was not the ideal hunting ground for husbands, but it was perfect for gossip. Who was spotted cheering too loudly? Who was seen slipping into the wrong carriage? Which well-bred gentleman placed suspiciously large bets with bookie? Newspapers loved the Derby for precisely this reason. It produced stories as fast as the horses could run. Dry truth? The Epsom Derby was basically the season's equivalent of a music festival, a mix of glamour, chaos, and spilled drinks, where you might see a duke, a duchess, and a drunk actor all standing in the same queue. These daytime diversions weren't just for fun. They were extensions of the season's central mission, visibility and network. To be seen at Ascot, to picnic at Henley, to make a discreet appearance at the Derby, all of it mattered. A family's social trajectory could rise or fall based on whether their names appeared in the society pages the next morning. It was also a chance for families to flaunt wealth outside the confines of the ballroom. A custom carriage at Ascot, a lavish picnic spread at Henley, or a private box at the Derby could broadcast status louder than any introduction. These were public stages where money, influence, and fashion were displayed as brazenly as the feathers on those towering hats. To us, it might look frivolous, racing horses, rowing boats, parading hats. But in the Gilded Age, these diversions were strategic. Every smile, every outfit, every appearance was an investment in a family's future. The season wasn't really about enjoyment. It was about survival in a world where a single snub could cost a fortune, and a single successful match could save one. Modern life comparison. Imagine LinkedIn, Tinder, and Instagram all rolled into one, played out over horse tracks and picnic blankets, with your mother breathing down your neck the entire time. That was the London season by day. But, like all performances, the curtain eventually fell. By July, the air in London grew thick. The Thames smelled worse than the gossip columns, and Parliament closed its doors. Families packed up their silver, their gowns, and their exhausted daughters, retreating to country estates for shooting and fishing. The season ended, but its consequences, marriages secured, reputations ruined, fortunes reshaped, lingered for years, which brings us to its decline and the peculiar legacy it left behind. If the London season was a glittering stage play, then it had two essential supporting casts. The first, the servants who made it all happen. The second, the gossip columnists who made sure everyone knew it happened. Without them, the season would have collapsed under the weight of its own satin gowns and scandal. For every heiress adjusting her ostrich feathers before a ball, there were a dozen servants sweating behind the scenes. Townhouses in Mayfair might require 30 or 40 staff to function smoothly during the season. Butlers polished silver until they could see their disappointed reflections. Footmen carried trays up and down endless staircases, their calves bulging like professional athletes. Ladies' maids ironed and re-ironed gowns that wrinkled the moment a debutante sat down. The kitchens were battlegrounds. Imagine producing 12 courses for 300 people, without refrigerators, without gas ovens, and with only candlelight to guide you. Cooks and scullery maids worked 16-hour days, emerging from basements red-faced, arms scalded, and smelling faintly of roast pheasant and despair. Servants also had their own hierarchy. The butler was king of the household staff, the housekeeper his formidable queen. Footmen jockeyed for status based on height. Yes, really, taller footmen were prized. And woe betide the unlucky maid who spilled soup on a duchess's gown. The shame might follow her all the way back to the countryside. Dry truth. The season was basically Downton Abbey on steroids. Upstairs, champagne. Downstairs, chaos. And of course, servants were not just workers, they were observers. They saw everything. Who slipped into whose carriage? Which gentleman overindulged in champagne? Which heiress received fewer dance requests than her mother bragged about? This gossip flowed freely below stairs, and often seeped upwards, carrying on whispers between households. Some servants even fed tidbits to newspapers for a little extra cash. After all, if you've just spent the night polishing forks until dawn, why not earn a bonus by telling a reporter which duke left a ball with the wrong woman? That brings us neatly to the second cast, the gossip columnists. London newspapers devoted entire sections to society news, and the season was their harvest time. Every ball, dinner, and picnic was chronicled in meticulous, and sometimes malicious, detail. The Morning Post, the Times, and later the Daily Mail knew that readers adored nothing more than scandal wrapped in satin. A young lady's social fate could be decided in print. A glowing mention, Miss So-and-so dazzled in a gown of white satin and pearls, meant more invitations. A pointed omission meant whispers of disgrace. A rumor of impropriety could sink a marriage prospect before dessert was served, and scandals abounded. Broken engagements made headline. A flirtation with an unsuitable man could tarnish a reputation permanently. Secret marriages were juicy fodder. One misstep in Hyde Park, or one overheard remark at a ball, might be exaggerated into a full-blown crisis once ink hit paper. Dry truth. If today's influencers live and die by Instagram algorithm, Gilded Age heiresses lived and died by gossip columns. Both are cruel, and both, unfortunately, have long memories. Why did gossip have such power? Because in a world where money and titles were constantly trading hands, reputation was the only stable currency. A good one opened doors, a bad one slammed them shut, and once your name was associated with scandal, no amount of pearls or Parisian gowns could undo it. So, the London season was not just about dinners and dances. It was a high-stakes game where every servant's whisper and every journalist's pen stroke could shift the balance of power. And yet, for all the glitter and all the whispers, one truth lay underneath. None of it was cheap. Behind every ball gown was a bill. Behind every invitation, a ledger. The season cost families a fortune, sometimes more than they could afford. So as we look at its decline and legacy, we also have to ask, was it worth the astronomical price of admission? By July, the London season collapsed under its own weight, quite lit. The air in London grew thick with coal smoke and horse manure. The Thames smelled like a soup best left untasted, and Parliament adjourned. Society packed up its gowns, its gossip, and its exhausted daughters, retreating to country estates for shooting parties and long naps. The curtain had fallen, but the echoes lingered. Marriages were made, reputations destroyed, fortunes shuffled, and of course the bills arrived. By the early 20th century, cracks began to show. The First World War ripped apart the aristocracy, drained fortune, and made endless champagne-fueled dances feel rather tone-deaf. Women began demanding rights beyond curtsies and invitations. Men who had fought in the trenches returned with little patience for feathered hats and whispered scandals. Even before the war, the season's absurdity was obvious. Satirists poked fun at its rituals. Newspapers began to cover scandals with more bite than reverence. By the 1920s, the idea of hauling your entire household to London for 3 months of matchmaking and cucumber sandwiches seemed faintly ridiculous. Society had new distractions: cinema, jazz, cocktail, divorce. By mid-century, the formal season was effectively dead. Queen Elizabeth II finally abolished the court presentation of debutantes in 1958, declaring the ritual outdated. It was a mercy for generations of young women terrified of fainting before royalty. And yet, the London season left its mark. Its echoes can still be felt today in events like Royal Ascot, in gossip columns that scrutinize who wore what, and in the continuing fascination with aristocracy. Shows like Downton Abbey and Bridgerton are essentially polished reimaginings of what the season once was, a high-stakes social market disguised as a parade of romance. The season also cemented the transatlantic marriage market. Without it, many American heiresses might never have met their dukes and earls. Without them, many British estates might have collapsed entirely. The season was the matchmaking app of its time, except instead of swiping, you curtsied. Now let's talk about the part everyone politely ignored: the cost. Running a season was ruinously expensive. Families spent thousands on gowns, jewels, carriages, flowers, and staff wages. A single Worth gown might cost what a working-class family earned in a year. A large ball could swallow several years of rent. And the flowers, oh, the flowers. Roses, lilies, orchids imported from hothouses, replaced daily so guests never saw a wilting petal. Hosting was not optional. If you wanted your daughter married off, you had to entertain. That meant dinners, musicales, and balls stacked night after night, each one more elaborate than the last. Skimp, and society noticed. Overspend, and you risked bankruptcy. It was the aristocratic version of keeping up with the Joneses, except the Joneses were dukes and marquises with slightly better titles. Some families treated the season as a last-ditch investment: spend a fortune now, secure a rich marriage, and recoup it over generations. Others simply bled money until the coffers ran dry. Behind the feathers and waltzes, there were balance sheets trembling in candlelight. Dry truth: the season was basically like burning money in the shape of ostrich feathers and smiling as you did it. What did all this achieve? For some, everything. A brilliant marriage, a secure fortune, a title grafted onto a family tree. For others, nothing but exhaustion and bills. The season was a game of chance disguised as a calendar of parties. Some families won, many lost. And yet, people kept playing, because the alternative, fading quietly into obscurity, was unthinkable. Better to gamble everything on gowns, balls, and scandals than to vanish into the footnotes of history. Looking back, it's easy to dismiss the London season as frivolous, and in many ways, it was. Endless parties, silly hats, social politics that revolved around which fork you used for fish. But beneath the surface, it was deadly serious. Marriage meant security. Networking meant influence. Gossip could shape dynasties. Perhaps the real lesson of the season is that humans will always invent elaborate rituals to prove their worth to one another. Whether in gilded ballrooms or on Instagram feeds, we crave visibility. We fear exclusion. And we will spend fortunes to avoid being forgotten. So, would you have survived a London season? Could you endure 3 months of late nights, sore feet, endless small talk, and the constant pressure of your mother whispering, "Smile more, dear, the Duke is watching"? Or would you have fled back to the countryside by June, content with fox hunts and hot tea? Either way, remember, behind every waltz was an agenda. Behind every curtsy a calculation, and behind every ostrich feather a receipt. The London season was never really about fun. It was about survival, and in that sense, maybe it wasn't so different from our own world. just with more lace and slightly better hats. If you enjoyed drifting back through the London season tonight, with all its gowns, balls and scandals, please tap the like button. It helps the channel more than you know. And if you'd like to join me for more of these bedtime journeys through history, make sure you subscribe. I'd also love to know where you're listening from. Is it a quiet bedroom, a train ride, or somewhere you shouldn't admit? Tell me in the comments. I always enjoy reading them. Until next time, sleep well, dream of candlelit ballrooms and riverside picnics, and I'll see you in the next story.